The pen was still warm in my hand when their lawyer forgot how to breathe. I had just signed away everything my husband owned. Across the table, his two grown children were squeezing each other's hands, smiling the way people smile when they think they've already won. Daniel had his phone half-raised to record it. Nora was crying the good kind of tears, the kind that come easy when you get what you want. Then their attorney turned to the last page of the file in front of him. His eyes moved across one short line. And the smile just slid off his face like it had never been there. He read it again. Set the paper down like it had burned him. Nobody in that courtroom knew yet what that one sentence was about to do to this family. I'll never forget it. But to understand how I ended up signing away every dollar in that room, you have to go back to the morning after I buried my husband. My name is Clara Bennett. The morning after we put Thomas in the ground, the farmhouse was so quiet I could hear the coffee maker tick. I'd lived in that house 6 years. Thomas and I married when I was 34 and he was 58, and the whole county had an opinion about that. I kept the books for the farm co-op 2 towns over, good with numbers, bad at caring what people thought. That morning I stood at the counter in his old flannel shirt, holding a mug I couldn't drink, trying to remember how to be a person. I didn't get long. By 7:30 I heard tires on the gravel. Then a second set. Then a third. 3 vehicles rolled up my driveway in a tidy little line, like a funeral procession that had gotten the date wrong. Grieving people don't carpool. I let them knock a while before I opened the door. I wanted one more minute of the house being only mine, because some part of me already knew that the second I turned that handle, the grieving would have to wait and the fighting would begin. Patricia led the way in, Thomas's older sister, 67, wearing the family name like a badge she'd earned in combat. Clara, she said, looking past me into the living room, already taking inventory. Nobody said sorry for my loss. Nobody asked how I was holding up. Daniel set a leather folder on the dining table where Thomas and I had eaten 10,000 dinners, and started talking about assets, the farm, the house, the accounts, the equipment, like a man reading a grocery list. Nora cried softly into a tissue and said she just wanted what was fair, what Daddy would have wanted. Then Patricia delivered the line she'd clearly practiced in the car. She looked me dead in the eye and said it slow, so it would land. You married him. We're made of him. There it was. I wasn't blood, so I wasn't real. Daniel slid a single sheet of paper across the table. I looked down and my stomach went cold, because I recognized the letterhead and I recognized the signature, Thomas's, shaky, but his. It was a loan. $180,000, taken against the seed barn and the acres around it, 8 months earlier, signed while he was deep in his second round of chemo and could barely hold a fork. The stated purpose was barn repairs. The real purpose was sitting across my dining table with his arms crossed. I remembered the day they got that signature. I'd pushed back hard, called the bank, asked if I could freeze it, slow it down. But it was a loan against an asset Thomas still legally controlled, and he was still of sound mind, sick as he was. He signed it because Daniel was his son, and a dying man wants to believe his son. The estate's responsible for this, Daniel said, tapping the loan, watching my face for panic. So the sooner we settle, the better for you. He thought the debt was a knife at my throat. I was doing arithmetic. The same arithmetic I'd been doing quietly for 3 years, and the numbers were landing somewhere none of them could see. All right, I said, and folded the paper in half. Something in my calm made Patricia's eyes narrow, like she'd heard a sound she couldn't place. My lawyer, George Foster, arrived an hour after they left, a careful man who'd handled Thomas's affairs for decades. I told him everything, the demand, the loan, every dollar, every property, every asset. He took off his glasses and rubbed his eyes. They have no standing to demand that. I'll fight every inch of it. I poured him coffee, and then I said the thing that would get repeated in every kitchen and church pew in the county by Sunday. George. I don't want to fight them. Give them all of it. He set his cup down like I'd started speaking another language. He spent 20 minutes trying to talk me out of it. I let him, because I couldn't tell him why. Not yet. A plan that leaks is just a rumor. By the end of the week, everyone knew Thomas Miller's young widow was handing the whole farm to his kids without a fight. I felt it at the co-op, conversation stopping when I walked in, a rancher I'd done books for a decade looking at me with something close to pity. I kept my head down. The numbers didn't care about gossip, and I decided neither would I. That night, after the house went dark, I went into Thomas's old office and opened the bottom drawer of his desk. Under a tray of dried-out pens, there was a folder, blue, cheap pressboard, soft at the corners from being handled. I'd put it there myself 3 years before, and checked on it the way you check a door is still locked. They'd all walked past that drawer that morning and never once wondered what a careful man and a woman who keeps books for a living might have done with 3 years and a terminal diagnosis. They saw a widow. They didn't see a bookkeeper. 3 years earlier, we'd sat in a doctor's office with bad carpet and worse news. Stage 4. Thomas held my hand and didn't cry. He was a farmer, he'd watched things die his whole life, and he understood the only dignity in it was being ready. On the drive home he was quiet a long while. Then he said, "Clara, I need to put everything right while my head's still clear." He knew his kids. He knew Daniel had taken from the farm before and called it a loan. He knew Nora had married a man who treated other people's money like weather, something that just arrived. And he knew that the day he was gone, they'd come for the land, and they'd come for me. "I'm not going to let them turn you into a tenant in your own house," he said. "We're going to do this the quiet way." The quiet way turned out to be a revocable living trust, drawn up by an estate attorney 3 counties away, far enough that nobody local would notice our car in his lot. You create the trust, a legal container, and move your property into it. Retitle everything so it belongs to the trust, not to the man. When the man dies, anything inside the trust isn't part of his estate. It never goes through probate. It can't be fought over, because legally, it was never his to leave. "Who do you want to name?" the attorney asked. Thomas didn't hesitate. "My wife. Clara. Trustee and sole beneficiary. Everything that matters goes in, and it goes to her." Over the next 2 months, quietly, we moved everything into that trust, the farmhouse, the land, the savings and operating accounts, even the good equipment. I kept every record in that blue folder, deed copies, account confirmations, dates, stamps. By the time we finished, Thomas Miller personally owned almost nothing. We told no one. Not George, not the kids, not a soul at church. "A secret 2 people keep is a secret," Thomas said. "A secret 3 people keep is just slow news." There was one thing we left out on purpose: the old seed barn and the parcel it sat on, kept in his personal name, so that when the time came, there would be something real to fight over. A meal, laid out for hungry people. "If I die owning nothing, they'll smell it," he told me once on the porch. "They'll go looking. Let them win the estate, Clara. Just make sure you never fight them for it. The second you fight, you make it look valuable." I didn't fully understand it then. I understood it completely the morning Daniel slid that loan across my table and told me the estate was responsible for it. Because that was the moment I realized the trap had a second jaw, and they were the ones standing inside it. In the weeks after the funeral, the family stopped pretending to grieve and started building a case. Daniel hired a lawyer with a billboard on the county road, and within 10 days I had a letter demanding a full accounting of the estate. I read it twice, made a note of the deadline, and went back to my dinner. They were demanding an inventory. I was happy to give them one, because the estate, as far as the law was concerned, was a failing barn, a scrubby parcel, a small checking account, and a $180,000 loan Daniel himself had engineered. Everything else, the part they actually wanted, wasn't in the estate at all. My phone buzzed. A photo from Nora's number, her daughter Ellie, 9 years old, gap-toothed, holding up a crayon drawing of a farmhouse with 2 stick figures out front. Me and Aunt Clara. Underneath, Nora had typed, "She asks about you every day." I set the lawyer's letter and the little girl's drawing side by side on my table. One of them was going to matter a great deal before this was over. It wasn't the one with the letterhead. The weeks that followed were a slow siege. Nora's husband came to the farm alone one afternoon, all soft talk about settling quietly, and let slip that they needed $110,000 by spring or they'd lose their house. Patricia worked the church and the pharmacy counter, turning true-sounding pieces into a false shape, letting that same cruel line travel through the county like scripture, "She married him, they're made of him." I wrote it all down in the blue folder. Not because I needed evidence. Because I wanted to remember, when the day came, exactly which lies I'd be straightening. I sat across from George one more time and told him not to fight the loan either, just to make sure that whatever they wanted, they got in open court, in front of a judge, on the record. He looked at me for a long moment, sensing the shape of something he couldn't quite see. "Is there something you're not telling me?" "No," I said. The only lie I told in this whole story. That night I finally opened a sealed envelope I'd found behind the deeds months before, a letter Thomas had written the winter before he died, on a bad day when his hands shook. He'd made me promise not to open it until I needed it. His handwriting was worse than I remembered. The words were steady. "They'll come for it all, Clara. Don't fight them. Let the paper do the talking." I read it 4 or 5 times, pressed it flat on the desk like I could absorb it through my skin. He'd seen all of this coming, from inside a dying body, while his children circled. And he'd reached forward through his own death to tell me to hold still. I sat in his chair until almost dawn. His plan only worked if I did nothing. That was the genius of it, and the hardest part. The phone rang 2 days later. It was George, his voice tight. "Clara," he said. The court date came through. 3 weeks. I felt the clock start ticking in my chest like a second heartbeat. 3 weeks, and everything Thomas and I had built in silence would finally have a room to stand in, a real judge, a real gavel, and a family walking in certain they'd already won. The 3 weeks passed like a held breath. Daniel posted long, sorrowful things online about family and legacy and people who marry in and forget what blood means. He didn't name me. He didn't have to. Patricia turned a simple estate hearing into a public event, organizing a prayer gathering at the church hall the night before, half the county invited to pray for healing and, in truth, to watch me lose. I went anyway. I stood in the back while she told the room, gentle-faced, that she hoped I'd finally do right by Thomas's real family. People nodded. Someone murmured amen. I said one thing before I left. Quiet enough that they had to lean in to hear it. I don't argue with people who never read the paperwork. Then I walked out and let them wonder. That same week, Daniel stormed into the bank demanding access to the farm's operating accounts, certain he was owed a look. The teller told him, politely and immovably, that those accounts weren't part of any estate. He heard theft instead of truth, called me that night furious, accusing me of hiding money. I told him evenly that I hadn't touched $1, and that he was welcome to tell the judge exactly that. It confused him more than any denial could have. He didn't know what to do with a target that wanted to be investigated. 2 days before the hearing, his own lawyer tried to warn him, sat him down, told him there might be a complication with the property titles, put it in writing, recommended they withdraw. Daniel signed an acknowledgement that he'd been advised and was proceeding anyway. "That's what we're paying you for," he said. "Make it go away." His lawyer couldn't make it go away. He could only file the trust into the record as part of the asset disclosure, almost as an afterthought, and hope nobody asked him to read it aloud. The night before the hearing, I read Thomas's letter one more time. Let the paper do the talking. I laid out my coat, set the blue folder by the door, and told him out loud that it was ready. Then I slept deeper than I had since he died. The courtroom was fuller than an estate hearing has any right to be. Patricia had seen to that. The family sat together on the right, a united front, Daniel in a suit that didn't quite fit, leaning back like he already owned the room. Across the aisle, his lawyer sat with his files squared in front of him, and he wasn't leaning back at all. He looked like a man waiting for a storm. I sat with George, my hands folded on the closed blue folder, calm as a Sunday. Daniel caught my eye and smiled, small, cruel, victorious. I didn't smile back. I just looked down at my hands and let him think it was defeat. The judge opened the file. She confirmed the proceeding was to distribute the estate of Thomas Miller, deceased. She asked the family to state their claim, and Daniel's lawyer stood and said the words I'd first heard across my own dining table: every dollar, every property, every asset. Then she turned to me. "Mrs. Bennett, you're entitled under state law to a spousal share. Do you intend to assert that claim?" I stood. My voice came up quiet and even. "No, Your Honor. I'm not asserting any claim. Whatever is in the estate, his children can have all of it. I'll sign it away right here, on the record." A soft exhale of triumph moved through their side of the room. Daniel clapped his sister's husband on the shoulder. Patricia closed her eyes like a woman whose prayers had been answered. "You understand this is final," the judge said. "I understand completely," I said. "Please read it carefully." I signed my name in the same plain, even hand that had balanced 1,000 ledgers and recorded a dozen secret deeds. The family celebrated in the restrained, churchy way people do in a courtroom. And then the judge, being thorough, asked Daniel's lawyer to read the full asset disclosure into the record, including the trust document he'd filed. The celebration kept going. Nobody heard it but the lawyer, who went very still. He read the small things first, flat and careful: the barn, the parcel, a checking account of a little over $4,000. Then he turned the page and paused. And then, because he had no choice, he read the line he'd found in the county records a week earlier and prayed wouldn't matter: that the farmhouse, the land, and the primary accounts had been transferred by recorded deed into a living trust 3 years before Thomas's death, and were therefore not part of the estate. He stopped mid-sentence. The silence that followed was the loudest thing I have ever heard. "What?" Daniel said, not loud yet, just confused. "What do you mean, not part of the estate?" The judge removed her glasses. "Are you telling this court the assets your clients have just claimed are not in the estate?" "It appears the principal assets were placed in a trust during the decedent's lifetime," the lawyer said. "The trust is not part of the probate estate. Mrs. Bennett has not contested the estate as it actually exists. And the estate as it exists," the judge read, "consists of a barn, a parcel of land, and roughly $4,000 in a checking account, subject to a secured debt of $180,000 against that property." I watched it land on each of them in turn. The husband understood the numbers first, and I saw the life raft turn to an anchor in his hands. Nora's hand slid from her mouth to her chest. Patricia just blinked, because she'd never dealt in dollars, only in blood, and blood doesn't read a balance sheet. And Daniel stood frozen between fury and understanding, because some part of him had just realized the loan he'd engineered, the knife he'd pressed to my throat across my own table, was tied to the barn. And the barn was now, by his own triumphant claim, entirely his. The loan, he said, and his voice had nothing left in it, is a liability of the estate you claimed, the judge confirmed. He turned on me. You did this. You set us up. I stood so I could answer him on my feet. No, Daniel. Your father did this 3 years ago, while you were too busy circling him to ask what he was thinking. I didn't set anything up. I just declined to save you from a debt you created. You wanted the estate. You demanded it, every dollar, every property, every asset. The court gave you exactly what you asked for. It was all true, and true in front of 40 witnesses is heavier than any insult. Nora's husband didn't even wait until we left the room. He turned on her right there, furious, blaming her for promising there was money, for a fortune that had turned out to be a debt no sane person would take on. I watched her understand, in front of the whole county, exactly what she'd married and exactly what he'd used her for. He walked out without her. Patricia rose next, trembling, demanding to know how Blood could be left with nothing. I finally answered the line she'd spent 3 weeks saying about me all over town. You told everyone I married him, that they were made of him, that blood was all that mattered, I said, gently, because gentle cuts deeper in a quiet room. He made his choice in writing. Signed, notarized, recorded, 3 years ago, while he was well. Blood had every chance to ask what he wanted. You were all too busy deciding what you were owed. She had no answer. There is no answer to a recorded deed. The judge distributed the estate exactly as they had claimed it, the barn, the parcel, the small account, and the debt sitting on top of all of it, and brought down her gavel on a courtroom that had come to watch a widow lose and had instead watched a family lose to itself. In the months after, Daniel and Nora tried briefly to challenge the trust. 2 lawyers told them the same thing. A properly funded, notarized trust, signed by a documented lucid man 3 years before his death, is nearly impossible to break without real evidence. They let it go. The barn came to them exactly as they demanded, debt and all, a millstone dressed up as an inheritance. Nora's marriage didn't survive the spring it was supposed to save. Patricia stopped attending the church where she'd held her rally, and the line she'd worn like a badge was never repeated in that county again. I went back to keeping the co-op's books, living in the farmhouse that had always, quietly, been mine. A few weeks later I called Nora and asked her to bring Ellie out to the farm. She came nervous, expecting more loss. Instead I told her I'd set up a fund inside the trust in Ellie's name, for her education, untouchable by anyone but the girl herself when she came of age. Nora cried the real kind of tears that time, and asked me why, after everything. Because she drew me a house, I said, and called me family, and never once asked me for anything. Outside, Ellie ran through the same grass I'd watched from the kitchen window the morning all of this began. Whatever the adults had earned, she hadn't earned any of it. She got a clean start instead, the one thing none of them had thought to want. People ask me sometimes if I feel bad about how it ended for them. I don't. I never took a thing that wasn't mine. I never raised my voice, never accused, never schemed in the dark. I just stood still and let people who decided I was nothing walk straight into the consequences of their own greed. Dignity was never about shouting the loudest in the room. It was about knowing exactly what ground I stood on, and having the patience to let the truth be read out loud by the very people who swore I had nothing.